The isolated life of a lighthouse keeper. The lighthouse stood alone against the jagged cliffs, an unwavering sentinel in a world where time itself seemed to stand still. Out here, on the edge of the world, the keeper's days were measured, not by clocks, but by the slow, persistent rise and fall of the tide, and the shifting colors of the sky. His name was Thomas, though to the ocean, to the storms, to the lonely birds circling overhead, he was simply the man who tended the light. Every morning, before the first blush of dawn painted the horizon, he climbed the narrow spiral staircase, his boots echoing in the cold stone tower. His hands, weathered by years of labor, moved automatically as he checked the oil lamps, adjusted the lens, and wiped away any dust or salt residue that might dull the beam. This light was his only companion, the only thing that connected him to the world outside. Thomas had been the keeper of this lighthouse for over 2 decades. He had arrived, a young man, full of restless energy, eager to escape the noise and complication of city life. The decision had been both a flight and a calling, an escape from a failed love, from the weight of unspoken words and unfulfilled promises. The lighthouse had offered him a kind of refuge, a place to heal, to reflect, and to reclaim some sense of peace. It wasn't that he had abandoned the world, it was just that here, amidst the endless stretch of sea and sky, he found a rhythm that allowed him to breathe. There was something meditative about the work. The care of the light itself, a constant in his life, was both a science and an art. The lantern's bright beacon, cutting through the inky blackness of night, was a simple thing, yet it held the power to save lives. It had been a task passed down from one keeper to the next, like a secret shared by the generations. The mechanical intricacies fascinated him. How the light rotated smoothly, how the lens bent and focused the beam, how the oil was fed precisely to the flame. Yet, as much as he was entranced by the details, he found solace in the ritual. The lighthouse was as much a part of him as his own heartbeat, and without it, he would feel like a ship adrift, with no course to follow. The isolation was another matter entirely. While he had long ago grown accustomed to the solitude, there were days when the silence was almost deafening. The sea, in its infinite grandeur, could be a comfort, but it could also be a reminder of just how small one man was in the grand sweep of the world. It was as if the lighthouse stood not just as a guide to sailors, but as a reminder to him of his place in the universe, unchanging, yet always on the verge of something greater. The sound of the waves crashing against the rocks below, the cries of the gulls overhead, and the wind that howled like a wild animal through the tower's narrow windows, these were the only sounds that broke the stillness. There were no other voices, no hum of traffic, no chatter of daily life. It was a life lived with the rhythm of nature. In the evenings, after the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the first stars began to pierce the sky, Thomas would take his place by the light, watching as the beam swept across the sea, a steady arc that seemed to stretch on forever. He was both part of the world and apart from it, connected, yet distant. As the light flickered to life each night, he would often find himself lost in thought, wondering what the ships that passed in the dark were like, who their crew members were, what dreams and hopes they carried with them. He had once been like them, a man on a journey. Now, he was the one who helped guide others home. And so the days passed. Some were quiet, filled with small tasks and quiet moments of reflection. Others, when the storms rolled in or a ship's distress signal reached the shore, were fraught with urgency. The light needed constant tending. It could never go out. That was his promise to the sailors, to the waves, to himself. As the years stretched on, the rhythm of the lighthouse keeper's life remained largely unchanged. The seasons came and went, with winter storms battering the cliffs, and summer sunsets casting a golden glow across the water. But as the years were on, Thomas began to feel the weight of time, not in the creaks of the lighthouse tower or the changing weather patterns, but in the quiet deepening of his bones. The ache in his back from the long hours of climbing the spiral staircase, the dull throb of his hands as he polished the lenses, the steady gray creeping into his beard, all of it was a reminder that he was no longer the young man who had first arrived at the lighthouse, full of restless energy and dreams of solitude. The light had been his companion, his purpose. But now, as he stood before it each night, A deep sense of fulfillment mingled with an unspoken sorrow. There was no one to pass the torch to, no family to carry on the legacy. The lighthouse keeper was a solitary figure by nature, but now, he felt the isolation more keenly. Visitors were rare. The occasional fisherman would stop to check on him, bringing news from the mainland or a fresh supply of food, but they never stayed long. Most ships that passed never even slowed, their lights, a distant promise that would fade into the night. One crisp autumn evening, as the first chill of winter began to settle in, a ship's distress signal sounded over the radio, followed by the frantic voice of a captain. Thomas's heart quickened. This was his purpose. This was why he was here. As the storm clouds rolled in, thick and dark, he sprang into action. He adjusted the light's focus, turned the fuel dial up, and made sure the foghorn was working, all while the storm surged outside. But in the middle of the rush, as the wind howled and the waves crashed against the rocks below, Thomas felt something shift within him, a quiet recognition that he was no longer the young man who could weather every storm, both literal and metaphorical. He had lived a long life here, perhaps longer than he ever intended. The ship made it safely past the cliffs, guided by his light, but Thomas remained at his post long after the storm had passed. In the quiet aftermath, he gazed out at the horizon, knowing that he had done his duty, and perhaps it was time to step away. The lighthouse would continue to stand, whether he was there to tend to it or not. The next keeper would come, just as he had, to maintain the light for another generation. In the days that followed, Thomas made preparations, cleaning and organizing the lighthouse as he had done for so many years. The storm had reminded him of the passage of time, of how swiftly the world moved, even when you stood still. One morning, as the sun broke through the clouds after a heavy night of rain, he walked to the base of the lighthouse, looked out over the sea one last time, and knew that it was time for him to leave. It wasn't a decision made in haste, but one that had come slowly, in the quiet hours when the only sounds were the lapping of the waves and the distant cry of a seabird. The caretaker of the lighthouse was no longer just a keeper of light. He was a part of the story of the lighthouse itself. His life, woven into the history of the tower, would remain as long as the beacon continued to shine. He had been the lighthouse's silent guardian, a man who had served without question, without expectation. And now, as he stepped away, he could leave with the knowledge that his light had guided many home, even if they never knew his name. On his final day, Thomas packed his belongings in a small leather bag, a few personal items, a couple of old letters, and a weathered photograph of the woman he had once loved. He glanced at the lighthouse one last time as he descended the steps, the beacon above him glowing faintly in the morning light. It had always been a symbol of hope and constancy, but now, it was a symbol of his own journey, a journey that had been long and meaningful, filled with both light and shadow. As he walked away from the lighthouse, he didn't look back. The sea stretched out before him, vast and endless, and the horizon whispered of new beginnings. For the first time in a long while, he felt a quiet peace, a sense of closure. The world was vast and full of unknowns, but he had lived a life that mattered, not in the grand, sweeping way the world often defines success, but in the quiet, steadfast way he had given his life to something greater than himself. The lighthouse would continue to stand, its light still burning brightly for those who needed it. And Thomas, the keeper who had once been its sole guardian, would fade into the history of the shore, a part of the landscape as permanent and fleeting as the sea itself. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss an update. Thanks for watching.